Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a market where the numbers are surprisingly bright. Even if the product itself feels a bit niche at first glance, we are doing a deep dive into the global glow tube market.
And a source material for this dive, it's the Global Glow Tube Market Illuminating Growth Projections 2021-2033 report. That's from Cognitive Market Research.
That's right. And our mission is to really dig into the revenue figures, the projected growth rates presented in this report, specifically looking at 2021, 2025, and the forecast for 2033. Across the key regions and countries they mention, we want to go beyond just the numbers, and see what larger insights they might sort of switch on about global trends.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating because looking at data for a specific, maybe even unexpected market like glow tubes, well, it can be a powerful lens. You can really use it for understanding broader economic patterns and regional development stories, too.
Right. Now, before we drown in data points, maybe we should quickly clarify what exactly is a glow tube in the context of a market report like this? I mean, are we talking about something for like rave parties or is it something else entirely?
That's a good question. The report categorizes glow tubes quite broadly,
Yeah.
actually. And yeah, it includes things you might find in industrial settings like emergency lighting, safety markers, but also components for certain types of displays or signs or maybe even niche lighting applications of various industries. It's definitely less about the novelty glow stick you might think of first, and much more about functional, often critical illumination or signaling tech, stuff used across manufacturing, infrastructure, safety, and even some specialized consumer goods. Understanding that context, it helps make sense of where the market's actually growing.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So it's tied into safety, infrastructure, industry, things that are happening globally. Perfect. Let's start at the highest level then, the global picture. According to the report, the global glow tube market brought in $2,325.58 million in revenue back in 2021.
Right. And looking ahead, that figure is projected to climb. Should reach about $3,105.74 million by 2025.
And the report forecasts a pretty significant jump by 2033, projecting the global market size to hit 5,539.02 million.
Yeah, that overall growth gives the market a global compound annual growth rate, or CAGR, of 7.5%,
Yeah.
which, that's a solid, steady pace for what initially sounded like maybe a super niche product.
Definitely indicates consistent, widespread demand and adoption expected over the next decade or so.
Exactly.
All right, let's zoom in now. Starting with North America, the report valued this region's market at $679.07 million in 2021.
And it's projected to reach $885.137 million in 2025, then growing to $1,495.54 million by 2033. That puts the region's CAGR at 6.776%, so just slightly below the global average, interesting.
Okay, and breaking that down by country, the United States, well, as the largest economy, it naturally leads the region. Its market was $563.628 million in 2021, growing to $728.467 million in 2025, and projected to reach $12,217.37 million in 2033. Its CAGR is 6.629%.
Right. Then you've got Canada following. It showed $93.712 million in 2021, projected growth to $115.953 million by 2025, and $182.455 million by 2033. So it's got DAGR is 5.83%. Solid, yes, but less rapid growth in the U.S.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting in North America, and where we see a significant outlier according to this data, Mexico. The report shows a market value of just $21.73 million in 2021, but it leaps to $40.71 million in 2035, and then projects all the way up to $95.71 million in 2033.
Wow, that jump gives Mexico a remarkably high CDR within the region. It's 11.276%.
Wow. Yeah, that's a CAGR nearly double Canada's, and I mean, significantly higher than the U.S. What might be driving that kind of explosive growth for glow tubes specifically in Mexico compared to its neighbors? Does the report offer any clues?
Well, the report mainly presents the numbers, but that kind of trend. It wrongly suggests factors like rapid industrial expansion, or perhaps growth in manufacturing sectors that heavily use these types of tubes. Could also be significant investment in infrastructure, safety standards, places where they'd be applied. It's a clear signal, really, of dynamic economic activity in areas relevant to this product.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift our focus. Across the Atlantic to Europe, the report recorded the European market at $486.047 million in 2021.
Right, and that's expected to grow to $627.36 million in 2025, with a projection to reach 1,069.03 million by 2033. So Europe's regional CGR is 6.889%, pretty much right around North America's pace.
Okay, and looking at some key European countries, the UK market was $65.6166 million in 2021, hitting $80.302 million in 2025, and expected to reach $127.215 million by 2033. That's a CAGR of 5.92%.
Then Germany, a larger market, showed $93.321 million in 2021, forecasted to reach $116.062 million in 2025, and $188.15 million by 2033, a CGR of 6.225%.
France was at $72.421 million in 2021, projected for $89.085 million in 2025, and $142.181 million in 2033.
Italy stood at $52.493 million in 2021, expected growth is $63.363 million in 2025, and $99.351 million in 2033.
Russia was $48.605 million in 2021, increasing to $58.344 million in 2021, rising to $66.28 million by 2033.
Sweden contributed $32.9079 million in 2021, forecasted to grow to $53.452 million in 2033.
Switzerland brought in $34.9928 million in 2021.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Switzerland brought in $34.9928 million in 2021, expected to hit $29.866 million by 2033.
And Luxembourg added $21.386 million in 2021, growing to $29.933 million by 2033.
Okay, now similar to Mexico and North America, Europe has this category with a really surprising trajectory. The rest of Europe. This category represents all the European countries not specifically broken out with their own numbers. It surged from just $7.291 million in 2021 to a projected 187.987%. Yeah. That's much higher than any of the individual major European economies we just mentioned. What could be happening in this rest of Europe category? What's driving such, disproportionate growth?
That rate really does stand out, doesn't it? It suggests pretty significant expansion in glow tube applications across, well, a collection of smaller, perhaps less mature European markets. Could be driven by increasing adoption of industrial safety standards, maybe, or growth in specific manufacturing niches, infrastructure upgrades happening in countries outside those major Western European economies listed individually. It's definitely a signal of broad, dispersed growth across the continent.
Okay. Let's pivot then. Let's go to Asia Pacific, which, according to this report, is the largest regional market overall. Its glow tube market was valued at $816.279 million in 2021.
Right, and it's projected to rise significantly, hitting $1,074.59 million in 2025, and then $1,866.65 million in 2033. So that's a strong regional CAGR of 7.146%, right in line with the global average, actually.
And China led the region, as you'd probably expect, $281.61 million in 2021, growing to $366.434 million by 2025, and projected for $619.728 million by 2033.
Japan contributed $144.481 million in 2021, expected to expand to $306.131 million in 2033.
India also saw consistent growth, going from $128.972 million in 2021 to $270.664 million by 2033. These are $156.799 million by 2033.
Australia will grow from $60.4067 million in 2021 to $113.866 million in 2033.
Singapore posted $33.467 million in 2021, rising to $52.733 million in 2033.
And Taiwan grew from $25.305 million in 2021 to $33.6 million in 2033.
Okay, and then there's the rest of APAC category, again, representing all countries not specifically listed. This category had an impressive surge, from $13.877 million in 2021 to a staggering $225.865 million by 2033.
Right, and that's a CAGR of 19.964%. According to the report, that's the highest rest of category CAGR across all the regions.
Wow. Almost 20% CAGR in a rest of category. We saw it in Europe, but it's even more pronounced here in Asia Pacific. What could explain such rapid growth in, a diverse group of countries not individually highlighted?
Well, this really points towards incredibly dynamic development happening across the smaller economies or maybe specific industrial zones within the Asia Pacific region. Could be tied to rapid urbanization, new manufacturing hubs emerging, maybe increased investment in safety infrastructure, or even specific technological adoption spreading really quickly in these areas. It just highlights that major growth isn't confined only to the largest economies.
Absolutely. It really shows the granularity you can see when you look at this kind of data. Now let's explore South America. This market was recorded at $158.14 million in 2021, and it's projected to increase to $288.029 million by 2033.
Right. That gives South America a regional CAGR of 5.376%. So solid, but maybe a somewhat more moderate growth rate compared to the global average or those powerhouse rest of categories we saw in APAC and Europe.
Okay. Breaking down the countries, Brazil led the region, $68.474 million in 2021, rising to $120.108 million in 2033.
Argentina posted $31.944 million in 2021, growing to $53.458 million in 2033.
Colombia added $21.981 million in 2021, rising to $35.474 million in 2033.
Chile posted $12.177 million in 2021, growing to $17.426 million in 2033.
And even in South America, we see a notable leap in the rest of South America category. It goes from $8.065 million in 2021 to $37.991 million in 2033. So that reflects a healthy CAGR of 11.163%. Similar pattern, yeah, though maybe not quite as explosive as in APAC or Europe.
Right. Moving over to the Middle East, the market there was worth $116.279 million in 2021.
And projected to grow to $188.327 million by 2033. This gives the Middle East a regional CAGR of 4.39%. Which, as you noted, is the most moderate growth rate among the regions listed. Okay, looking at countries, Saudi Arabia recorded $36.047 million in 2021, expected to reach $55.368 million by 2033.
Turkey brought in $23.023 million in 2021 and will rise to $34.275 million by 2033.
The UAE saw $18.953 million in 2021, forecasted to reach $27.684 million by 2033.
Qatar contributed $11.163 million in 2021, growing to $15.066 million in 2033.
And the rest of the Middle East category, well, it made a solid jump from $11.5163 million in 2021 to $33.71 million in 2033. That's a CAGR of 8.238%. So again, higher than the regional average for the Middle East itself.
Interesting pattern there. Okay, finally we turn to Africa, a market that this report indicates is poised for, well, genuinely rapid growth.
Yeah.
From $69.767 million in 2021, it's forecasted to make an enormous leap to $631.449 million by 2030.
And that's a phenomenal increase. That figure in 2033 is almost 10 times the 2021 number.
It certainly is. It posts a really robust regional CAGR of 15.772%. And Nigeria shows particularly strong performance, rising from $31.535 million in 2020.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Strong performance, rising from $31.535 million in 2021 to $275.312 million in 2033. That's a CAGR of 15.477% for Nigeria alone.
Wow. South Africa also shows substantial growth, going from $27.767 million in 2021 to $241.213 million by 2033.
Right, and the rest of Africa category follows this high growth pattern too, starting at $10.465 million in 2021, expected to reach $114.924 million by 2033. Its CAGR is a very high 17.289%.
So unlike some other regions where we saw the highest CAGRs maybe concentrated in the rest of categories or smaller countries like Mexico, what does this overall high growth across the continent suggest about Africa's economic trajectory, at least, through the lens of this specific market?
Yeah, that's a great point. It really suggests a broad-based, rapid expansion in the underlying sectors that actually use glow tubes. This could be massive infrastructure development, significant increases in industrial capacity, perhaps stricter adoption of modern safety standards in construction, manufacturing, or even urbanization driving demand for relevant products. It signals that the conditions for this market's growth are really present and accelerating across much of the continent.
Okay, so we've taken quite a trip around the globe, haven't we? Through the lens of glow tube sales and projections. We've seen steady growth in established markets like North America and parts of Europe, but truly explosive growth in specific areas like Mexico, those rest of categories in Europe and Asia Pacific, and, well, across almost the entirety of Africa. It's fascinating how these numbers, for what seem like a simple product, can tell such varied stories about regional development and investment.
Absolutely. And what's particularly insightful, I think, is looking at that range of CAGRs.
Right.
The global average is solid, yes, but the outliers, the ones with double-digit or even approaching 20% CAGRs, like rest of APAC, rest of Europe, Africa as a whole, Mexico, they aren't just random spikes. They often seem to correlate with regions undergoing significant transitions, like rapid industrialization, major infrastructure projects, or maybe catching up on safety or industrial standards. The slower, steadier growth in established economies might reflect more replacement cycles or just incremental upgrades, while that high growth elsewhere really points to new installations and widespread adoption.
Right. So what does this all mean for you listening to us discuss, well, glow tubes? Why care about these specific numbers?
Well, because this level of market data, even for a niche product like this, provides a really concrete illustration of global economic trends. When you see high growth rates for something used in infrastructure or industry in regions like Africa or the rest of APAC, it's not just about glow tubes. It's a kind of micro indicator of macro shifts. Investment flowing into development, industries expanding, cities growing. It helps make that abstract idea of emerging markets or regional development feel more tangible through the demand for specific goods and technologies.
Absolutely. It's like a little peek under the hood of the global economy, just through the demand for a very specific item. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the global glow tube market numbers.
Yeah, and as you mull over these figures, maybe consider what specific drivers you think might be most impactful in those high-growth regions. Is it primarily, say, government-led infrastructure projects? Is it foreign direct investment in manufacturing?
Right.
Or perhaps involving local consumer demand for safety or certain types of lighting? Thinking about why these trends are happening, that's where the real insight lies, I think.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating corner of the electronics world today.
Yeah, the glow tube market.
Exactly, specifically those iconic Nixie tubes. It's not just about old tech.
No, not at all.
It's this whole scene that brings together like incredible retro aesthetics, a lot of modern interest, and honestly, a really passionate community around it.
It's quite something. And important to say up front, right? All the insights, everything we're discussing, it's all sourced directly from cognitive market research.
Absolutely. Full credit to them for the data.
So our mission today is really to dig into what that research tells us.
Yeah.
The dynamics of this unique market, the key trends that are shaping where it's going,
Right.
and also how these kind of external forces, thinking particularly about global trade policies, how they're actually impacting even a niche like this one.
Yeah, it's surprising how far-reaching that stuff can be. Okay, so the research points to some pretty strong drivers for interest here. It's more than just, oh, that looks cool, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. The report really underscores the unique power of, well, nostalgia, obviously, but also just the distinct visual appeal of Nixie tubes.
That glow.
Exactly, that warm, almost sort of organic orange glow. And the way the numbers are, physically there inside the glass tube.
Right, not just pixels on a screen.
Precisely. It's become this key symbol of, like, retrofuturistic design. The research points to how they're used in high-end clocks, maybe audio gear.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those.
Right, where the display isn't just functional. It's a deliberate statement piece. It's this blend of art and engineering that, honestly, modern displays just can't replicate in the same way.
And building on that, the idea of projects and applications, the research also flags significant demand coming from somewhere else entirely.
The DIY community.
Exactly, the global DIY electronics community.
Yeah, the report really notes how the expansion of online platforms, YouTube tutorials, Reddit communities, those specialty marketplaces like Tindy, has been absolutely instrumental.
Made it accessible.
Totally. They've made these kind of obscure components available to almost anyone. And projects like building your own Nixie clock have become, well, almost an aspirational goal for electronics enthusiasts.
Right.
The research shows this isn't just a tiny fringe group. It actually fuels a steady demand for the tubes themselves and, the related components. It's a crucial base for the market.
Okay, so you've got the high-end aesthetic appeal on one side and the grassroots DIY passion on the other. The research kind of brings those together under a third driver, This
audio was created with podcastle.ai.
kind of brings those together under a third driver, this growing niche for high-end consumer products.
Yes, the report specifically identifies this. So beyond the individual DIYers, there's a legitimate market for, say, artisan-crafted clocks or professional-grade audio equipment that uses these vintage displays, even custom installations.
So not mass-market stuff.
Definitely not. These are luxury goods, really, where that unique aesthetic justifies a premium price point. The research suggests that, at this level, the inherent high cost and the rarity of authentic Nixie tubes actually becomes acceptable, even part of the appeal. It validates the market's existence despite all the challenges.
It's fascinating how that specific look creates so much value, but as you mentioned, challenges. There are significant ones the research points out. What's like the biggest hurdle identified in the report?
Well, the most fundamental issue, according to the research, is just the extreme limitation of supply. We're talking new old stock tubes here,
Stuff that's been sitting around for decades.
pretty much. Large-scale production stopped, a long, long time ago. So the market is almost entirely dependent on leftover inventory. A lot of it from the Soviet era, actually.
Wow.
The report highlights this not just as a supply issue, but as the core constraint. It's what prevents any significant market growth or, scalability. And that leads directly to things like price volatility. Inconsistent quality depending on how the tubes were stored for maybe 40 years.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And ultimately, it's a finite resource. It will run out eventually.
So you're basically building this whole market on a foundation that's slowly disappearing. What about actually using these old parts with new technology? The report flags that as tricky too, right?
It does, yeah. The research points to the technical complexity as a major barrier, specifically the high voltage requirement.
Oh, right. They need a lot of juice.
A lot. Nixie tubes need like 170 volts or more of DC power. That's completely incompatible with modern electronics that are running on, 3 volts, 5 volts?
Totally different worlds.
Exactly. So the report emphasizes that integrating Nixies requires specialized, high-voltage power supplies, complex driver circuits, and at significant design difficulty and cost. Especially for smaller businesses or hobbyists who don't have deep expertise in power electronics.
And I guess handling them isn't exactly straightforward either.
Not at all. And the research actually quantifies the impact of both cost and fragility. Authentic tubes, they can cost anywhere from, say, $20 to well over $100.
Per tube.
Per single tube, yeah. And they're made of glass, obviously, with really delicate internal structures, which makes them highly susceptible to damage during manufacturing, assembly, shipping. You know it.
Nightmare for logistics.
Right. The report contrasts this sharply with modern LED displays, which are far more durable, way cheaper to produce, and significantly less risky to transport.
Okay, so limited supply, high voltage needs, high cost, fragility.
Yeah.
Those are pretty substantial constraints.
Huge constraints.
Given those hurdles, it sounds like the market has to be finding new ways forward, right? What does the research identify as the key trends trying to address these problems?
Well, the report notes something really exciting, actually. The small-scale resumption of new manufacturing.
Wait, people are making new Nixie tubes?
A few, yes. There are some highly skilled artisans in small workshops that are actually producing new Nixie tubes again. The research identifies this as a critical trend, albeit still small, but it offers a potential path to long-term sustainability, beyond just relying on dwindling old stock.
That's incredible. People are actually, building the machines and learning the glass-blowing techniques to make these again?
It really is quite something. Reviving complex, almost forgotten manufacturing techniques.
Wow.
And alongside that revival, the research highlights a trend towards making the integration part much easier.
Ah, tackling that complexity issue.
Exactly. The rise of modern, user-friendly driver boards, these basically simplify the complex power and control requirements.
So they handle the high voltage stuff.
Yeah, these integrated modules, they handle the high voltage conversion, the interfacing signals. The report sees this as a key factor in lowering the technical barrier for enthusiasts and, smaller companies looking to incorporate Nixies into their products without needing to be power electronics wizards.
Okay, so bridging that technical gap makes sense. What about for people who maybe they love the look but aren't necessarily purists about having the original vintage tube?
That's where the third trend comes in, which the research also discusses. LED-based simulations, often called Lixie displays.
Lixies, okay.
Yeah. These typically use layers of acrylic and modern LEDs to closely mimic the aesthetic of real Nixie tubes.
Huh. Do they look convincing?
Pretty good, actually. The report recognizes this as a significant market response to all those constraints we talked about: high voltage, fragility, cost, scarcity. It offers a very similar visual result,
Right.
but without the headaches. It's a practical alternative for consumers who prioritize that vintage look, but want modern reliability and, frankly, lower cost.
Fascinating. So you see innovation happening by looking back, literally recreating the old manufacturing, and also looking forward with new tech like simulations and easier integration boards.
It's a real mix.
But the research also points to something much bigger impacting this kind of specific niche market,
Yeah.
global trade policies.
Yeah, this is where the external environment, as detailed in the report, becomes a major factor. According to Cognitive Market Research, 2025 saw the U.S. administration reintroduce some pretty aggressive trade policies. Notably, they mentioned the Liberation Day tariffs.
Liberation Day tariffs, the research describes these as aggressive. How so?
Well, the report lays out some really sweeping measures. It notes tariffs ranging from, say, 10% on imports, even from close allies like the UK and Australia.
Wow, even allies.
Yeah, up to much higher rates like 34% on Chinese imports and potentially up to 46% on goods from Vietnam.
Ooh.
And on top of that, the research mentions a kind of universal 25.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
And on top of that, the research mentions a kind of universal 25% tariff on specific materials like steel and aluminum, plus tariffs on auto parts.
Okay, so how does this big picture macro policy connect back down to electronics, and specifically something as, well, niche as glow tubes?
The research explicitly lists the electronics and electrical sector as one of the hardest hit by these measures. Now, for niche markets like glow tubes, while the tubes themselves might not fall under the absolute highest tariff categories directly, the impact comes through increased costs for the components.
Yeah.
The things needed for those driver boards we mentioned,
Cool.
the power supplies, the final assembled products. The report specifically calls out tariffs like 25% on semiconductors,
Wow.
0.20% on lithium-ion batteries, maybe 10-15% on finished consumer electronics like laptops. And it emphasizes how these tariffs on foundational components just ripple throughout the entire sector.
Yeah, those are significant percentages hitting core parts of pretty much any modern electronic device.
They absolutely are. And the report details how these measures are directly driving up prices and, well, dampening demand across various electronics subsectors, everything from home automation and computer hardware to broader consumer electronics. It affects profitability. It affects consumer purchasing power.
And China is still a massive player in the supply chain for all these components, right? Even if the final clock or whatever is assembled somewhere else.
Absolutely. The research highlights China's continued dominance here, exporting over, I think it was $119 billion in electronics to the U.S. back in 2023.
Huge number.
It is. And the report emphasizes that the impact of these tariffs isn't just confined to goods coming directly from China. It extends throughout the global supply chain because so many products assembled in places like Malaysia or Vietnam still rely heavily on Chinese subcomponents.
So the tariffs create these ripple effects internationally.
Exactly. It's complex.
So how are U.S. electronics firms, both large and small, responding to this, according to the research?
Well, the report indicates that U.S. firms, particularly those operating with pretty tight margins, are seeing significant increases in their input costs. The research suggests a rise of maybe 18% to 25% directly linked to these policies.
That's a big hit.
It is. So in response, many are actively diversifying their sourcing. They're looking to alternative markets, India, Mexico, other parts of Southeast Asia. The report also mentions that some firms are actually redesigning their products to try and reduce reliance on components that are now subject to these higher tariffs.
So these massive global trade policies are directly influencing everything from the biggest electronics manufacturers right down to potentially impacting the cost and availability of the tiny components needed for, say, a small artisan Nixie tube clock.
Precisely. And the research uses this whole environment to underscore why, in such a volatile global landscape, detailed market research becomes less of an option and more of a strategic necessity.
Right. You need to know what's happening.
Exactly. It helps companies, even in these niche markets, understand shifting supplier locations, identify opportunities for maybe redesigning products to mitigate tariff impact, track those fluctuating cost trends, and just navigate the complex regulatory changes. The report basically suggests that companies adopting these research-driven strategies are simply better positioned for resilience and, well, competitive advantage.
Okay. So what does this all really mean, then? We've done this deep dive into the glow tube market, guided by all the insights from cognitive market research.
Yeah, at its core, it's just a fascinating case study, isn't it? Where this vintage technology, really powered by aesthetics and passion, finds surprising new life.
Definitely.
But the research clearly shows it faces these really fundamental constraints. that limited supply of old stock,
The NOS tubes, yeah.
the significant technical hurdles, especially with the high voltage, and just the inherent cost and fragility of the tubes themselves.
Yet the report also highlights the market's resilience, doesn't it? Driven by that vibrant DIY community.
Absolutely.
Validated by that high-end product niche, and it's adapting through these really interesting trends like the revival of small-scale manufacturing
Which is amazing.
and developing those user-friendly driver boards to make things easier.
And critically, I think the research reveals how this seemingly kind of insulated niche market isn't immune to major external forces at all. Those global trade tariffs, as detailed in the report, they add layers of complexity, they increase costs for essential components, and they disrupt supply chains on a global scale, impacting even these small, dedicated communities.
It's a really powerful illustration, isn't it, as the research shows, of how vintage aesthetics can genuinely drive modern markets, but also how these broad strokes of global economics influence even seemingly tiny corners of industry and culture.
It certainly is a complex picture, no doubt about it.
Okay, so thinking about all this complexity, the nostalgia, the tech challenges, these big global forces, here's maybe a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. In a world that's constantly focused on rapid technological advancement and, let's face it, obsolescence, what other forgotten technologies, maybe gathering dust in warehouses or just in history books, might be uniquely poised for their own kind of nostalgic resurgence? And, maybe more importantly, what external forces, perhaps unforeseen trade dynamics, maybe environmental factors or cultural shifts, could ultimately shape their fate in our modern world?
That's a great question. Really makes you look at technology and economics a bit differently. And of course, if you're interested in diving deeper into the glow tube market, or frankly, any other market, remember all the detailed insights we discussed today came directly from cognitive market research. They offer really comprehensive analysis, including specialized global, regional, country-specific reports, plus market forecasts that can give you a much deeper understanding of all these dynamics.
Absolutely. Definitely the place to go for that level of detail. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until next time, stay informed and keep exploring these fascinating intersections of tech, history, and the global economy.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai